What does courage look like? On the 9th of April, 1945, at the concentration camp in Flossenburg, a German pastor was completing a worship service for his fellow prisoners when he was summoned by the Nazi guards and led to his execution. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This year, thousands of Christians will mark the 80th anniversary of his death. Bonhoeffer was among a minority of Christians in Germany who dared to say no to Hitler, who refused to cooperate with evil, to attempt to sabotage the regime. And for that, he was killed. It's difficult for us to believe that in the 1930s and 40s, the Christian church in Germany was easily swayed by the politics of Hitler. But at the end of World War I, Germany was in ruins, and a very charismatic Hitler slowly rose to power, promising a new Germany that would rise above the rubble. As we know, Hitler targeted religious and ethnic minorities, and many Christians bought into the hatred that Hitler spewed. Today, as we witness the politics south of the border and the rise of the religious right, with those who claim to be Christians spouting the most un-Christ-like messages, perhaps it's not so difficult after all to imagine that the church in Hitler's Germany could lose its footing. But as the masses were being swayed, there were a significant number of Christians, both leaders and lay people, who ran the course, who could not be swayed, who stuck to their principles and formed what came to be known as the Confessing Church. Now, Bonhoeffer was a key leader in this movement. He was an academic, a pastor, and an activist. As a scholar, he yearned for knowledge, but his theology was very practical, and he talked about what it meant to serve his neighbor and to imagine that Christ was in his midst. He preached on the Beatitudes and wondered aloud how the poor, the meek, the disinherited could be blessed, not only in the kingdom that is to come, but in this world at this very moment. This highly intelligent and influential man was actively involved in the resistance movement, working with others in secret to bring down the Third Reich. For a brief while, Bonhoeffer worked as a double agent, using the information he gleaned from the Nazis to weaken the foundation in hopes of bringing the government down. In 1944, Bonhoeffer was accused by the Third Reich of treason. He was imprisoned, and on April 9th, 1945, he was executed. Bonhoeffer's death is tragic, and the tragedy is amplified when you consider his life was cut short at the age of 39, and that his execution took place only 4 weeks before the Allies brought Hitler to its knees, and the Third Reich fell to the ground. Bonhoeffer knew in the very depths of his being that by professing Christ and acting against the government, his life might be taken. He would have to be willing to lay down his life for Christ. In the moment when he was led to the gallows, Bonhoeffer told his fellow prisoners, "This is the end, but for me, the beginning of life." Bonhoeffer resisted evil. In ingenious and underhanded ways, he resisted the empire. Which brings us to today's scripture reading. So we just heard the extraordinary story of the two midwives, Shifra and Puah. Now, once again, in a nutshell, the story goes like this. In recent decades, the Israelites, also known as the Hebrews, have grown in number within the nation of Egypt. Feeling threatened by the rise in numbers and thinking these people might overthrow his government, the Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites. But even under the enslavement, the Israelites continue to multiply. And Pharaoh is determined to stop the growth. He seeks out the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and orders them to kill the male Hebrew babies whom they deliver. Now, scholars are not sure whether Shiphrah and Puah are Israelite or Egyptian, but it's clear that they deliver babies of both ethnic groups. Two women whose calling is to bring life into the world are suddenly being ordered to put an end to this life. So I cannot imagine how these women must have felt. We do know that by their actions, they engage in an act of sabotage. They defy the king and allow the Hebrew boys to live. Now let's be clear, pulling one over on the king of Egypt is a huge risk. In 2025, it would be akin to defying the dictator of North Korea, or maybe Putin, who has unlimited powers and never hesitates to execute his enemies. When the king discovers that the Israelite babies are continuing to thrive, he confronts the midwives. And Shiphrah and Puah come out with an explanation that I think is very clever, and I think it's quite comical. I can just see them throwing up their hands in this mocked state of amazement and helplessness. Well, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife arrives. What are you going to do? And I can see the king scratching his head. He is flummoxed. What does he know? He's never been present at a birth. Days later, the king reissues his order, this time to all his people. Every boy that is born to the Hebrew people, you should throw into the Nile. Now, Shiphrah and Puah, of course, in a quiet act of subversion and insubordination, continue to defy his orders. And Scripture tells us that these women, quote, fear God. And it's a phrase we read often in the Hebrew Scriptures. Perhaps their spiritual stance is not so much rooted in fear of punishment at the hands of God, but rather rooted in a deep-seated respect, a tremendous sense of awe. And these women know in their very bones what it means to do the right thing, to choose life. In due time, by honoring life, they are rewarded by God. In the words of Amanda Delosio, the action of Shiphrah and Puah is the first example in the Bible of individual moral resistance to empire. The story of these women is the backstory of the birth of Moses. An Israelite woman, fearing that her newborn son might be murdered, places him in a basket and sends him down the Nile. She prays he might be saved. So we all know about Moses. And now, thanks to biblical scholars and storytellers intent on bringing the stories of women to light, we can celebrate the story of Shiphrah and Puah. Heroes of the resistance. They push against the tide of tyranny, violence, and power. These are the stories we need to hear in 2025. Stories of brave midwives, stories of a German pastor named Bonhoeffer who chose to put his life on the line for the sake of his neighbor in whom he saw the face of Christ. Today we began our worship with the words, "Christ bids us come and die." As morbid and as unwelcome as this message is, These were the words of Bonhoeffer, who knew only too well what it meant to die to the easy life, a life that was willing to be swept along by the tide of evil. In 2025, what does courage look like? Courage looks like 3,000 members of the Syrian Civil Defense, otherwise known as the White Helmets. As we speak, in the aftermath of the Syrian civil war, unexploded bombs litter the landscape of the nation. The White Helmets are volunteers, men and women who daily put their lives at risk as they take on the task of finding and dismantling unexploded bombs. What about here in Canada? What does it mean for you and me to be courageous here, now? We do not find ourselves in post-war Syria, in Nazi Germany, or in ancient Egypt, all times and places characterized by violent dictatorship. But we do find ourselves in perilous times. Acts of courage might be simple and small. They might be political or not. Nelson Mandela once said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." Courage can mean refusing to stay silent when someone makes a derogatory comment about someone who is queer or poor or new to Canada. Courage can mean living with an anxiety disorder, and even in the midst of the fear which threatens to overwhelm you, you forge ahead and do that very thing that you are afraid to do. We can be courageous, my friends, because of Christ, because of the one who laid down his life and was resurrected, whose Spirit breathes and moves within us, granting us the power to do things we thought to be impossible. In this lies our hope, our challenge, and our grace. Thanks be to God.